Hello, welcome to Jason the Old Millennial. My name is Jason, speaking here in my basement in the great state of Kansas. Today's video, I am going to do a deep dive on my favorite band of all time, the Beatles, as I am going to do a top 10 favorite Beatles songs in a live stream tomorrow. As I was ranking every single Beatles song, I'm up to my 10 favorite songs. So I thought, usually with the top 10, I usually do a deep dive. So I thought, yeah, it might be fun to do a deep dive on the Beatles here to kind of complete that list anyways, and my love for the Beatles anyway. So this is going to be quite an undertaking trying to do a whole summary of the Beatles in 20-30 minutes. So we'll see if we can do it here on Jason the Old Millennial. Hello everybody, hope everybody's doing well here on a Thursday late afternoon, early evening period. And yeah, so I'm down to my top 10 favorite Beatles songs, so I thought I'd probably just do a live stream so I can knock out the top 10, which would be pretty fun, I think, to do. And usually I do, I've been doing deep dives on different bands and stuff like that, and usually when I do a deep dive, I also do the top 10 of my top 10 favorite songs. So I thought, I wasn't thinking about doing the Beatles just because I talk about the Beatles so much. And I usually do deep dives on bands I don't know enough about, and I want to learn more about that band anyways. And I usually go through the whole discography and all this. Well, I've gone through the Beatles discography 100 times, so I know the discography very well, so I don't have to go through that. And my notes for this is right here. Yeah, blank piece of paper. Because I didn't need to do any research because I've done research my whole life on the Beatles. So I think I can do a pretty good deep dive on them just by what I know on top of my head. So we'll go with that anyway. So yeah, so bear with me. We talk about such a great band, the Beatles, and of course you've heard my thoughts on them very many times, why they're my favorite band. But we give a little bit of a history lesson on them as well to anybody who doesn't know. I hear there are people that aren't big Beatles fans. I don't get it. I don't get that it's possible, but I know it's possible. So for them, hopefully enjoy learning a little bit more about their history. So talking about the Beatles, we have to start in 1956, I think. 1956, John Lennon, he's 16 years old. He's in high school, whatever, secondary school in England. And he wants to start his own band. So he grabs some of his friends from school, and they started a band, a skiffle group, as they called them at the time. And they called it the Quarrymen. And that's because the high school, I think, was called like Quarry High School or whatever, secondary school. Something to do with the quarry, so they call themselves the Quarrymen. John knew a little bit about playing guitar, and so he was the lead guitar player and singer of the group. The other friends weren't exactly musicians, but they learned enough, I guess, they can play. And this would be kind of the basis of the Beatles, believe it or not. Of course, it was with John Lennon kind of starting his own band. Now, Paul McCartney, who, of course, all four Beatles lived in Liverpool. And Paul McCartney and John Lennon had a mutual friend, which I'm forgetting. I don't know if it was Pete Shotton or I'm forgetting now. I should have looked that up. But they had a mutual friend who knew both John and Paul. And Paul, of course, was playing guitar. He had a guitar, and he was, wanting to be a rock musician, and John wanted to be a rock musician. And so a friend said, hey, to Paul, you should come to this outside show where they're playing songs outside, and, watch them, and I'll introduce you to John. And I guess he must have known that Paul would be interested maybe in joining a band or something. So Paul went along, he brought his guitar with him, and went and saw John singing for the Quarrymen. And afterwards went back, this friend, introduced him to John backstage. And Paul pulled out his guitar and played Bebop-A-Loo, I believe, by Gene Vincent. And was already, pretty good. He's 15 years old and he's already, doing pretty good on the guitar as you can at that point. Of course, still learning, but enough to impress John that John decided to invite him into the group. And so Paul joins, and this is 1957, by the way. So John and Paul meet in 1957. Paul joins the Quarrymen. So that's obviously a very important piece of the Beatles, John and Paul meeting and starting their music careers together. So yeah, so they started playing around gigs around Liverpool and all that, and of course continuing to try to get better as a guitarist and all that. And Paul had a new friend named George Harrison because they traveled on the bus home from school. They must have lived kind of close to each other anyway. So after school, they'd be on the bus, and so they kind of sat together and they kind of found common ground in that they loved rock and roll music and they loved playing guitar. And so they became pretty good friends just riding on the bus. And uh, I'm guessing they probably had their guitars with them and played them in front of each other because Paul knew that George was a good enough guitar player, and George was almost a year younger than even Paul was at this time, and so he uh, invited him to, or kind of got him to audition for John because John thought he was too young at first. But the story is that they were on a upper decker bus, and somehow Paul got to where George and John and them were together, and they're, I guess, by themselves basically. And he had George pull his guitar out and say, play that raunchy song. There's a song called Raunchy at the time that was very popular and it had a somewhat more difficult guitar part to it. And so George played it perfectly in front of John. So John kind of reluctantly kind of decided to let him into the group because he's good enough. He didn't like it that he was too young maybe, but he can recognize he was a good enough guitar player. He can add to the group. Now, by the time we get to 1960, let's say, the rest of the Quarrymen have basically quit because none of them were really musicians or really had ambitions to be rock musicians like John Paul and George did. And they went on to, of course, start out their careers, went to, college or whatever, and started a career and making money. Of course, that's the whole thing is you need to make money. While John Paul and George, they rather just try to make money playing at gigs and stuff, and then getting like a regular real job and all that. So them three stuck with it. Everybody else left, so the group was just them three: John, Paul, and George, who all played guitar. So there's no bass, there's no drums, just three guitar players doing gigs, anyways. So when we get to 1960, in Hamburg, Germany, there's, of course, it's a big port city. There's lots of clubs there. And they needed some live music rock acts, English rock acts, because those were getting very popular in Germany at the time, English rock music. And so promoter went to like Liverpool and, looked for some bands to come, that he can have put in the clubs. And so there's a guy, I can't remember his name, but he was kind of somewhat a promoter in Liverpool that kind of took over a lot of bands like the Beatles. Of course, they weren't called the Beatles yet at that point, but that I don't think so. They might have been pretty soon. Because they took away the Quarrymen after like everybody kind of quit and it was just them three. I think they did away with that name, and they were doing names like Johnny and the Moondogs, and they did eventually come to the Beatles. They even called the Silver Beatles for just a little bit of time. So it might have been around this time they came up with the name of the Beatles. I can't remember, but and John came up with the name, and he came up with a story. I don't think it's true, but kind of made for a fun story to say how he came up with the name. And he told a reporter, like a local Liverpool reporter, that he had a dream and there was a man on a flaming pie who told him that their name should be the Beatles. Anyways, that was the whole story. But I think realistically, it was just they were big fans of Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And so because they're called the Crickets, that was an insect. So I think they're going with that name. Let's go with an insect name. And so Beatles was the insect name they went with. But yeah, they changed it from Beetles to Beatles. So you had the beat, like a drum beat in there. So it kind of changed it up a little bit and made it more, musical, I guess, in a sense. Anyway, so around that time, I guess he probably did come up with the Beatles at that time. Anyways, but so they were asked, or they got a chance to go to Hamburg, but they only had three guitar players, and the promoter said, you need a bass player and a drummer before you can come to Hamburg. So they, really wanted to go do this gig because, again, paid pretty good money for, and like I said, they're like teenagers. So the chance to get paid money to play music and all that and travel, to Germany, was enough for them to, do what they can to get a band together. So they ended up auditioning and getting a drummer named Pete Best. Pete Best, his mother, Mona Best, owned the Casbah, which was a Liverpoolian club. She turned the basement into a club basically, and Mona Best's son Pete Best played drums, and so they kind of got connected there, and he joined the group. For a bass player, John, he at this time was going to art school, and he had a friend named Stuart Sutcliffe. They became best friends basically, and Stuart Sutcliffe was a really good painter, and was even sold some of his paintings and made money. And they needed a bass player, even though Stuart never played the bass, didn't know anything about playing the bass. They said, "Hey, you can use your money that you paid for this painting and buy a bass guitar and join us in Hamburg." And I guess he thought that was intriguing enough, the idea of traveling and playing clubs and doing something new. And he was good friends with John, so he went with it, bought the bought the bass, and learned just enough, I guess, to I don't know if he really could get by. He just learned enough to kind of be up there and play with them, but he really couldn't hang with the other Beatles as far as I can serve. So that's kind of like the core of the first, inclination of the Beatles was those five members. John, Paul, and George on the guitar, and Stuart Sutcliffe on bass, and Pete Best on drums. So that's like kind of the original Beatles, lineup, I guess that you can say in a sense. So they go to Hamburg and they play for, I think, 3 months or so, like 3 or 4 months. So quite a bit of time there in Germany, and they learned so much. It really became, they really grew a lot as a band, I would say, in their Hamburg, because they had to play for hours and hours every night, throughout the night, if new people are coming in, and so they're constantly playing new stuff. And I mean, they're covering stuff. They wrote some songs, but they weren't playing them yet, of course, at that point. And their songwriting wasn't real great yet. They were still learning kind of that. Paul and John, of course, would start writing together. But yeah, so they're in Hamburg, playing at these clubs, really learning not just, how to play as a band together, but also to put on a show in front of the audience, have stage presence. So they really kind of got their stage presence from those months in Hamburg, I think, and really kind of learned how to be a cohesive band in a sense. So then when they came back, they really thought, I think we have something here. Let's keep, plugging away, basically, and got, a lot of gigs around Liverpool, and really started getting a following around Liverpool as one of their biggest local bands, and played at the Casbah. The Cavern Club is like the most famous place that's really well known for the Beatles, anyways. And they would even go back to Hamburg and do another stint there, I think, the next year in '61 or so. But then by that point, Stuart Sutcliffe really didn't want to continue on as a bass player because he just really wasn't his thing. And he wanted to go back to studying, painting and stuff like that. And so he kind of basically left the group at that point. So they needed a bass player. So none of them really wanted to pick up the bass, but Paul eventually took on the bass play anyways. And so that was the band. Just up, he had Pete Best at drums. Of course, while they're at Hamburg, they actually meet another drummer named named Richard Starkey, I should say, but went by the name Ringo Starr as like a nickname. Ringo was drummers for a band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, another Liverpoolian band. And it was there that they kind of met and hung out with Ringo and kind of became friends with him. And Ringo even joined in a couple times on drums if Pete Best couldn't make it. They even got Ringo to go to play for them anyways. And they really started getting to like Ringo a lot more. There's all these talks about what happened to Pete Best, I think a lot of it is just that Pete never was real friendly with the other three Beatles. Like, he was a little more of a loner. He wasn't as talkative. He wasn't hanging out with them. They just never really built a real, deep friendship or camaraderie with Pete Best. And he kind of did his own thing. And so when they met Ringo and they were hanging out with him, they're having fun with Ringo. And plus Ringo, I think, was just a better drummer than Pete Best. And so when he was playing for them, filling in for Pete, I think they found that I think Ringo is a better fit for this band than Pete is. But at the moment, they still stuck with Pete at that time. But anyways, so yeah, they're playing all these clubs and everything. Then they met a guy named Brian Epstein. Brian Epstein his family owned a store, and he ran the record store, part of the overall store that they had. anyways, and became pretty successful. He was doing pretty well uh, with the record selling, anyways, and so he knew a lot of music coming in, and he'd always get new music to, if there's a demand. And while the Beatles were in Hamburg, they were picked to do a backing for a guy named Tony Sheridan. And Tony Sheridan was a guitar player and a singer in England, anyways, and was not real famous, I don't think, but he was making a record, so he's definitely much better known, of course, than the Beatles were. And so the Beatles backed him up as kind of a backing band while he recorded some music. And the Beatles even got to record a song called My Bonnie. And My Bonnie, I guess, was like a single that guy even got put out and got some traction. People were buying the records. And like I said, they were getting a pretty good following in Liverpool. A lot of people coming to see him in the Cavern Club. And so Brian Epstein kept hearing people ask, do you have My Bonnie by the Beatles? And he's like, I don't know what, he didn't, I think at the time, didn't know who the Beatles were exactly. But then someone said, oh, they play here at the Cavern Club. When he heard that, he's like, oh, I need to go check, them out. And I think he eventually did get My Bonnie in and listen to it. And, he wasn't a rock guy necessarily, but he could see that there's some talent there. And so he went and saw them and saw that they had a really good stage presence. Like I said, it was really what I think impressed him, and thought they really have something here that could go somewhere. And so met with the Beatles after he saw them at the Cavern Club, and said, would you like a manager? I like to, manage you. And of course, the Beatles needed a manager. They really didn't have one, and just a local guy promoted them. But so they took Brian Epstein on as manager, and that was a huge event there. I mean, that really helped the Beatles get noticed to the record companies. Of course, Brian Epstein came up with some ideas at a time that I think helped. He kind of made them more clean-cut image that would appeal, I think, to a wider audience and to record companies. He had them, when they played together, wear the same matching suit, so they all matched. And of course, at this time, they also they started the Beatles haircut, which they got from being in Germany. There's people in Germany that I think started this like longer shaggy haircut. It was considered long hair at the time. Today, it wouldn't be considered anything, but at the time, men just wore really, crew cut type haircuts. And so to grow your hair out just a little bit was kind of rebellious. So, but the Beatles kind of came back from Germany with this, new look of this shaggy kind of hair. And that really, caught on. And so they had that, but so they had that look going for them, and they wore the matching suits. And he had to make sure they had like a set list, because they would just wing it every night. And so I said, let's write down like what songs and what order you're going to play them, be a little more organized. Also had them bow after each song. They would bow to the audience. So he came with this kind of ideas that kind of became iconic, synonymous with the Beatles at that time. But of course, he had them record some demo songs and stuff, so he can go around to the record companies and play it for them and try to get him a record deal. Of course, the number one thing. So he went to like different places and he got rejected. And Decca Records, famously, the guy said guitar groups are on the way out. He said to Brian, which, I mean, that guy should have been fired. I mean, one of the mispredictions ever in history of music. Guitar groups are on the way out. No, they're going to be very much in for quite a while. And it sucks for all those companies not grabbing the Beatles when they could, because that was a gold mine that they didn't get onto. But eventually he got onto EMI Records, heard and took them on, and made a record deal, and they put together their producer, George Martin, to be the producer for the Beatles. Again, what a great pick for the Beatles, getting George Martin, who's a bit of a genius, I think, producer. He didn't do any rock music at the time, but he was producing classical music and also comedy, like the Goons. He produced some of their comedy albums, which is a very popular comedy kind of group in England. Anyway, so he didn't know music. I mean, he played piano, so he knew music pretty well. And though he didn't know rock music, he met with the Beatles, and he saw that they had a great personality, that their personality really came through, on stage and all that, and through their songs, and that they had a great sound to them. And he can see that they could make some good music anyways and be something. Anyways, so at that point, John and Paul now we're talking about 1962, I should say. This is happening around 1962. They're getting a record deal with EMI, and at the time, Paul and John were writing songs now, and so they wrote a number of songs, 4 or 5 songs, and put them together and showed George Martin because they really wanted their single to be a song they wrote. George Martin was kind of looking for other people writing a song and then giving it to the Beatles and have them play it, which was very common at the time, to not even write their own material, but to get someone else who wrote a song and get that song and get your band to play it and see if they can make a hit out of the song. Anyways, a lot of cover songs too as well at that time. But and of course, the Beatles knew a bunch of cover songs because that's what they did in the clubs. But they were writing some songs and they put it forth, and George Martin looked at them and didn't think they were necessarily that great. But he one song he thought could work was "Love Me Do," and so he decided to put that out as their first single, "Love Me Do." And "Love Me Do" did pretty well. It went number 19 in the charts. I mean, so it wasn't a #1 hit, but still, for your very first single, going to number 19, still that's a pretty good sign that you got something and people were liking what you're putting out anyway. So that was definitely a very good start for the Beatles. But George Martin still was looking for a "1 hit, and he even came up with, found a song called, I think, now I'm forgetting, but "How Do You Do," I think is the name of the song. Anyways, and he thought this could be a #1. He thought the song was good enough that the Beatles could make a #1 hit out of it, and they probably could have. That's the funny part. But the Beatles really wanted to make a #1 hit out of a song that they wrote with Paul and John wrote, and so they're like, no, we really want one of our songs. So a bit of a fight, but John brought a song called "Please Please Me," and he did it. It was a very slower song, actually. It was a little slower paced song, and George said, it's a little too slow. If you make it a little bit faster, you might have something. Anyway, so John went back, wrote in a pretty good guitar riff in there, and also added harmonica to it, and definitely made it very fast-paced and more of a fast-paced rock number than like a slow ballad that he was originally trying. So they did that, came back, presented that to George Martin, and George Martin said famously, "You have your first #1 hit." And he was right. When that song came out, their second single, it went #1 in the UK and became their first #1 hit. Obviously, and so really definitely making them a little bit bigger name with the #1 hit behind their name. And the company definitely was thinking, okay, we need to come out with an album now. I think a lot of times you had to come out with a hit single before you started coming out with albums. And before they believed, okay, we can get an album, put that on there, or whatever, and sell some records. So they started producing the first like "Love Me Do" came out in 1962, late 1962. "Please Please Me" came out like early 1963. So they came up with the first album called "Please Please Me" off of their #1 hit, and of course they already had 4 singles basically, because they had "Love Me Do" and they had a B-side to that, and they had "Please Please Me" and the B-side to that. So they had 4 originals they put on there. And they ended up putting 8 original songs and 6 cover songs to finish the album. So they came up with some other, 4 other originals to put on there. And you got like "Standing," what's it called? "She's Standing There," whatever, which was a great song to begin the album. I Saw Her Standing There. Sorry, I couldn't think of the name, but "I Saw Her Standing There." First song on the album, great opener to it. So they had a lot of good originals there, along with "Please Please Me" and "Love Me Do." And like, I think "Do You Know a Secret" and "P.S. I Love You," I think was maybe on there. Anyway, so they had some great originals. And then they put together some pretty good cover songs as well, including "Twist and Shout" at the end of the album, which great ender and probably the best cover song they ever did. But anyway, so they put it all together. In fact, they recorded the whole album, I think, in like one day. I mean, because they knew a lot of the cover songs already by heart. And so they recorded them pretty easy. But I think it took them like one day to record this whole first album. And they put it out, "Please Please Me." An album did very well. It was a #1 hit album for them. And really starting to become pretty big at that point in England. They would go to London, and of course that's where EMI was. And they would play at a place called the Palladium, which when I was in London, I have a picture at the Palladium that they played at. And there was a show that they called Sunday Night at the Palladium. It was like a big show that was televised. and they'd bring in bands to play. And the Beatles got to play on one of those Sunday night at the Palladium, and that was the beginning of Beatlemania, is what we would call Beatlemania, which is when fans were just going crazy, and the fandom was just getting out and starting to get out of control at this point. Where they would play, and women were just screaming, passing out in the aisles, women just going crazy. Girls were over the song. I think not just because the music was definitely, it was really good rock music at the time, very heavy music for the time being. And also the Beatles, they had the shaggy hair, which was something cool, new. And of course the girls thought they were cute. And they did things like shake their heads when they played, and their hair would, move, and that just drove the women crazy. And they did stuff like woo, and they did stuff like that just girls just went crazy. Anyway, so that was when the crowds were just getting huge for the Beatles. They're getting mobbed everywhere they went. People were mobbing, were following them, huge crowds. I mean, they couldn't go anywhere. In fact, so after they played that Sunday night Palladium, and one of the journalists was there to watch it and saw the huge fandom that was growing there for the Beatles, he wrote an article and he called it Beatlemania. And so so that's when they coined that first term, anyways, that we use a lot of times to describe that period from the Beatles. Anyway, so that definitely was a big point, a turning point for them. And they were touring in other places like France and Holland. And so they're starting to tour other countries. They definitely were becoming the biggest band in England. And we're going to other countries and getting the biggest band in Europe at that time. Also putting out a bunch of #1 singles, like From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. All their next singles are all going #1 in England. So yeah, they're just getting a really great following here in 1963. Now in America, we weren't quite catching on to the Beatles yet at that point in 1963. In fact, some of their music would come over and never just caught on right away. The American company was called Capitol. EMI is like American company, I guess, or what we'd call it. And they didn't want to put out the Beatles. They were put out, and like Please Please Me never came out in America as an album in 1963. And so a smaller company called VJ, very recording company, whatever, or that would put out music. They ended up putting out the Beatles' first music out there, anyways, because Capitol wouldn't, anyways. And like I said, none of their stuff was charting yet. It didn't exactly catch on with everybody. They even put an album together called Introducing the Beatles, which was basically Please Please Me, but they called it Introducing the Beatles. And I think maybe they changed it a little bit. I forget, but that was kind of the first one coming to America at that time. So, but everything would change in 1964 when the Beatles first came to America. And now at this point, I think I'm gonna have to stop the video here and call this part 1 and do a second part, because I'm just barely starting on the Beatles. This is just how the Beatles got together and how they started catching on as a hit band in Europe. And so next I can talk about them coming to America and really becoming the biggest band of all time and the rest of their career. Anyway, so please stay tuned for that part 2. Hope you enjoyed this part 1. Some of you are Beatles fans already. You already know this information, but hopefully somebody comes across this. Maybe you learned a little bit about the band and why they're so great anyway. So, but thank you a lot for watching the video and for liking it. Thank you to all the subscribers for supporting the channel. I appreciate you all. Hope you have a good day.